Dobré ráno and good morning, all of you. Thank you for coming. It's the fourth day of the International Teaching Week, and it's not easy to keep your attention for 4 days in a row. But today we have a special guest from India. So I would like to introduce you to Paramita Bose, and she's going to give us a completely different perspective on the topic we are talking about. Because as you already saw her, Dr. Paramita Bose, she's a assistant professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in India, in a private university, Mahindra University. Is the pronunciation correct? Okay, Mahindra University. And among her interests, we can name Indian writing in English, because she's an English assistant professor, woman rights things, and something like a cultural studies or urban studies. But today's lecture is a case politics in the cultural realm, drawing and reading discrimination. And I can reveal one of the secrets. She said that she might mention some graphic novels, which is one of my favorite genre in novels. So Paramita, the floor is yours, and once again, thank you very much for your coming from India to be with us. Thank you. You're welcome.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Paramita. I teach English literature and cultural studies at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at Equal Central College of Engineering. So I teach engineers humanities, and that is quite a challenging thing. So what I'm going to talk about today is something that is very specific to India, and that is the idea of caste. And a parallel can be race politics that you see in US and such things, but I'll come to that. This is something that is very, very specific to India and not outside of it. So before I go in, I'll try and define a couple of things. I'll try and define discrimination and then give you a sort of a background to what the caste system in India is. The Cambridge Dictionary defines discrimination as treating a person or particular group of people differently, especially in a worse way from the way in which you treat other people because of their skin color, sexuality, etc. Now, India is a democratic nation and a secular nation. And there is a constitution that rules us. And though the Constitution of India ascertains that citizens are treated equally and given equal opportunity in every field, the truth of the matter is not that. It is away from it. And India has an extensive, complex social stratification system. And with regard, and this is very specific to the Hindu religion, not to the others. And this social stratification is based on the profession that you pursue. And it is important for us to understand that this profession is not out of choice, but out of a category that you are born into. So your family for generations can only have that kind of a profession, and social mobility becomes very problematic. And I will try and explain that to you. Please bear with me. So the Hindu society is divided into 4 varnas or castes. 1, the Brahmins, the uppermost caste of priests and scholars. Mythically, they are said to be born out of Brahma. Brahma is the creator god in the Hindu pantheon. From his head, the Brahmin is appointed to be the guru of the other 3 varnas, and I'll come to the other 3 varnas in some time. The second is the Kshatriyas, and these are the upper caste comprising of rulers, warriors, administrators. They emerge out of the arms of Brahma. The Vaishyas are mostly traders and businessmen, born out of Brahma's thighs. And the Shudras, or the working caste, mostly laborers, are born from Brahma's feet. And that is the hierarchy of the order. The Brahmins followed by the Kshatriyas, followed by the Vaishyas, and followed by the Shudras, in terms of acceptability, etc. So if a Shudra wants to become a priest, that isn't possible, because that is the social mobility that is not allowed. Or if a warrior wants to become, I mean, obviously people are not willing to go down the hierarchy. It's always upward mobility that we are looking at. And beyond these four varnas are the Ati Shudras, and that's the bit that I'm going to talk to you about today, who are vehemently kept out of the civil society functions. They are thought of as untouchables, looked at as pejoratively, and prohibited from even coming near members of the upper caste. They are denied dignity and denied basic human rights. Now, just to give you examples of what is the sort of lifestyle that they generally encounter. So they're not allowed into temples. They're not allowed to drink water of the same well as the upper caste people, etc. And of course, yeah, no access. The upper caste might not want to sit next to somebody who is an untouchable, etc. So this is a very complex social stratification system. Now let me also put it out here that India doesn't function in this fashion at this point, but this is the sort of base that I'm going to build up on, and that is where the contribution of somebody by the name of Ambedkar becomes very, very significant. I'll come to that in some time. So the reason the reason I'm using graphic novels to talk about this particular thing, and I've been interested in graphic novels for about 15 years now, and in my class on cultural studies, I used these two particular texts to talk about caste politics. Now, when I say this is not the reality of India, while that is true, the current youth, at least the set of students that I teach, belong to a very particular section in society, like Professor Yaroslav mentioned. It is a private university, which means that people who have access to wealth are the ones who get into this kind of a university. So they function within this bubble of privilege in very many ways. And for them to understand caste politics, it is a huge challenge. And if I get them to read writings of Ambedkar, that has not been possible. So my intervention has been using these graphic novels because they are a popular format, because they are quote-unquote easily accessible, and somehow the understanding is that it is not serious literature. Now, I would want to contest that, but the assumption is that it is not serious literature, and hence we will be willing to read something of this sort. So that is my resort to going to a graphic novel and using it to talk about psychological and physical trauma with regard to caste-based discrimination. All right, so I'm going to talk about two particular texts. One which is called, just a second, So one which is titled Bhimayana and the Experiences of Untouchability. Now, these are the cover pages, and that's the first page of the text. And I know it might not be visible, but at some point maybe I'll share these books with you, and you can read it and get back to me. But the basic thing that I want us to keep in mind at this point is, so Bhimayana, I don't know if any of you are aware of the Hindu epic by the name Ramayana, which is the story of Ram. So Bhimayana then becomes the story of Bhim. And I have lost connection. Yeah, that's all right. That's all right. That's not a problem. So maybe I can take a minute and show you a couple of these drawings and try and gather some sort of a response with regard to how you see this graphic novel. I'm again working with the assumption that all of us have read at least one graphic novel or comics in our life. Is there anybody who's not read a comic book in their life? Really? Okay. Oh, that's nice. Okay, a comic strip. Do we know how a comic strip looks? Do we know how it looks? Okay. All right. Anybody who's not read a graphic novel? Okay, all right. No, no, I'm just trying to understand here. So comics, and I will spend a minute here to try and distinguish these two in some sense. So comics are multi-volume things. So if you look at a newspaper, they will have a strip one day and they'll have another strip the other day. These are self-contained pieces also. The narrative is self-contained there. So if you miss today's edition of a particular comic book, a comic strip, you can come back the next day and still make sense of it. Graphic novel, because it has the terminology novel to it, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's a complete piece of a document that you have. So it is not serialized and published. It comes out as a particular book. More importantly, a lot of comic books can have the quote-unquote fun element. Generally, graphic novels are more serious in nature. A lot of the times they've been used to talk about trauma, talk about war, discrimination, all of that. The most significant graphic novels being Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which talks about the Holocaust. There's Joe Sacco's Palestine, which talks about the war in Palestine. There's Guy Delisle, I was talking about him a couple of days back, who's also talking about travelogues. There's also Bimayana alongside. There's Persepolis by Marjan Satrapi, who's talking about the war in Iran, the revolution in Iran, and all of that. So a lot of graphic novel has been used to talk about trauma in very many ways. And Bimayana sort of grows out of that lineage in some way. But maybe for people who have read a comic strip or a graphic novel, if you can give me some sort of a feedback on how this is similar to it or different from it, I can take it on from there. Anything that you notice that is curious here? That's because it's a picture. Yeah, sorry.
What's the difference between those black and white drawings and those colorful?
And colored ones. Okay. Yeah. I'll address that. Maybe I'll take all the responses and then get on.
Fine.
Yeah.
Because there is some meaning.
Yes, there is.
Especially the mouse and also the Persepolis.
Correct. They're all in black and white. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Any other comments that you might have? There's a lot of text, yeah. I want you to notice the speech bubbles, please. Now I'm giving you pointers. And I want you to tell me if all of them look the same. They don't? Do you think there could be a possible reason for it? So how many kinds of speech bubbles are there? Let's break it down there. Okay, 3. That's great, yeah. And what are these 3? Can you describe them to me?
One sounds to be from above. It's like a mermaid, I think.
Okay.
And then we've got the, let's say, the one which is directed to the plow, to the field. And it's the one that sounds to be the most humble. Mm-hmm. And then rests with force directed to heaven.
Okay, all right.
Thanks.
All right, thanks. Anything else that you want to point out? Yes?
I think this is a very interesting way to graphically show that traumatic situation. You said that there are some graphic novels about Holocaust. I don't know, like cartoons about Holocaust. Interesting.
See, I think we have to draw that line that these are not cartoons but graphics, right? That's the basic intervention that we are trying to draw here in that sense. All right, I'll take the black and white pictures again first, and then move on to the speech bubbles. Now, with regard to the mostly graphic novels have been in the black and white or very, very light colors. But one of the things that Bimayana is consciously trying to do is to use folk art form. So this is a very particular folk art form from India, which is called the Gond art. and it is located in the central part of India, and this is practiced by tribals, and in that sense it is also being practiced by the Atishudras in that sense. So it is taking an art form from the indigenous people and then putting it out in a popular format. So it is creating that sort of an intervention in the first place. Now with this tribal art form, usage of color is very integral to it being quote-unquote auspicious. It's part of their cultural dialogue in some sense, which is where the colors come in very many ways. Now it's very important for us to notice that none of the human figures are colored though. And that goes back to this entire idea of human beings being similar, equal, egalitarian society. And the moment you sort of color them, you are discriminating them against each other. So you consciously avoid color for representation of human beings in this particular graphic novel. Throughout, if you read the whole of it, it's a 120-page graphic novel. None of the human beings are colored, and because it is an intervention in terms of untouchability and color and caste politics and things like that. So that's the usage of color in that sense. With regard to the speech bubbles, I don't know if I can point it out, maybe I will. But the one here, I don't know if there's a way to do this. But maybe I'll just walk up there, and if you can see an eye here, that's all right, no problem. I'll manage. If you can see it towards the panel, there's an eye that is drawn here. Can you see that? Yes, no? There's an eye. There's an eye. So that refers to a contemplation, that's a thought, that's not necessarily being spoken out. That is something that is in the mind of the person, all right? Now if you move to the top panel of the same picture, those are the tails of a serpent, all right? Or a scorpion. A scorpion tail is what it is supposed to denote. And the reason the scorpion tail is being used is to depict the venom. So everybody who is venomous in terms of thought, in terms of words that are spoken against these untouchables, have been given the speech bubble of a scorpion's tail. The third one, of course, resembles a bird. And that is the more human one. That is on the panel which has the black, the blue, and the gray and colors. You see a lot of these other bubbles which sort of look like a bird or look like a dove or a sparrow, or yeah, you can take a call which bird. But essentially it is something that is supposed to be mild, gentle in nature. So this is how the artists as well as the authors, so Durgabai Vyam and Subhash Vyam are the artists, and Sri Vidya Natarajan and S. Anand are the authors of the text. I will give you the names in a bit. And it is this conscious collaboration of the artists and the authors that is happening here, wherein they give you these markers to sort of understand and study the text. Now what this is also then attempting to do is to try and create what I call a visual literacy. A visual literacy where meanings are located in pictures or in drawings that you have. The other thing that they are trying to do is the idea of a critical literacy, wherein they give you a certain ideology through the text, that this is the ideology that you side, and it is left for the readers to figure out whether they want to side this ideology or not, whether you respond to it, refuse it, contest it, or accept it. The point of the text is to not create a certain ideology. It is for you to develop it. So that way it becomes a very actively engaging text for the readers to read. Now there is a section in this one particular, in this particular book which talks about the art of Bimayana. Now these are not analogies that I'm making. This is there in the text. I'm just stating it for you for our understanding, wherein they state that and if you read the section on art of Bimayana, you sort of understand the clues that are given to you in very many ways. And maybe when you read the text from cover to cover the first go, you will miss these things. But when you read art of Bimayana and come back and read the text again, it'll have a different meaning. I must have read the text at least 20 times till now, because I teach it at length in college. And every single time I've found something new there. And which is where it's like this treasure box that you have, where every single time you open it up, there is something new that is coming your way. So meanings, and what I was talking to you about, the entire idea of visual literacy and meaning that is generated out of it becomes very, very significant. Any questions, comments that you might, yes?
I just want to ask if it's possible to turn on this television, because I'm a little blind in my 20s, so. This one. Yeah. Yes.
Is it turning off?
It's turned off, yeah.
I can try it. Try it.
I'll use the time and raise my hand and ask a question. Which type of ideology? You mentioned the ideology, and is it some specific that is put exactly to this type of comics, cartoons?
So with regard to Bhimayana, it is very anti-caste. So, and that is where I'll come to in a bit also to talk about this particular publishing house that is bringing out this kind of literature. Is that on? Oh, that's amazing. Wonderful. Yeah. So this publishing house goes by the name Navayana. Navayana means a new vehicle. And they are very particular about publishing only literature that is anti-caste. So they are publishing stuff that works actively towards an egalitarian society and does away with caste politics. So when you have a text like this, as well as the second one, if I have the time to talk about it, that is, these are texts that sort of get you to accept and respond to the sort of ideology that they are trying to put forth, saying that caste-based discrimination is a reality in India. It is something that is modern, and that is something that is next on my list to talk about. And it is something that is prevalent and should be talked about. Like, all of us know so much about race politics, etc., and gender politics and all of it. And somehow caste, and believe me, and India is a massive, massive country, right, with billions of people. So to have not spoken about a discrimination based on caste in the global platform, in the global domain, is undoing a certain kind of history. So the project is also to look at writing history from a very different perspective. So that's also the idea. Does that answer your question? Yeah. All right. Sorry. So I'll just move on from here and talk to you about a bit about what the content of the book is. Now, Bhimayana is divided into 3 sections, and this is called Water, Shelter, and Travel. Now, these are incidents from the life of Bhimrao Ambedkar. Now, Ambedkar is a very significant person with regard to the national history of India, because he is also the chief drafter of the Constitution of India. So he's very, very significant politically as well. And of course, he's born a Dalit, and by Dalit I mean the Atishudras. He's born into the untouchable category, and he goes to school and is not allowed to sit on the benches. He sits on the corner, and he's not allowed to drink water. And that becomes the first story when it's called Water. He's not allowed to drink water alongside the other students that are there in their class, because everybody is scared of getting impure. And that becomes the first defining incident. The second one, of course, is shelter. Now, Ambedkar gets a degree in law from Columbia University. His education is sponsored by one of the kings in Baroda, which is in central India again. Now, when he comes back, he joins the king as an administrator there, but nobody is willing to give him a place to stay, because again, the question is of untouchability, and you cannot accommodate people from the untouchable class alongside other people. So he spends days in the park, at the railway station, he fakes his identity, but that's a constant struggle that he's going through. And eventually what he does is he leaves the job and goes back. He's unable to continue it because he doesn't find a place, doesn't find a shelter, so as to say. The third one is where he is politically very active. He is sort of emerged as this leader of the underprivileged, and he wants to undertake this journey alongside a lot of people. And again, no one's willing to ferry him because of the caste that they belong to, and they get an unskilled driver to get them at some point. This person doesn't know how to drive. They all meet with an accident and such things. So these are the three defining incidents that are spoken about in Vimayana. But the larger context is to place this this idea of caste-based discrimination within the paradigm of modernity. Now, I'll just quickly go back to the first picture here, and if you look at the third drawing there, which is the page 1, that is where the contemporary nature of the problem comes through. So these are three people sitting at a bus stand somewhere in the 2000s and having a conversation about how caste-based politics is a reality and is still deterring the quote-unquote upper caste people from getting a privilege. Now, there is some kind of a context that needs to be set here. Now, post the country becoming a republic and the drafting of the constitution, there is a realization that the untouchables and the lower caste people have been reprimanded for a long period of time. And there was necessity for what is called substantive equality as opposed to formal equality. Now, formal equality talks about constitutionally everybody has similar rights, but substantive equality is something that enables this kind of equality, that enables egalitarian society. So one of the key points to this is reservation. And what do I mean by reservation? So if you were from the underprivileged section, if you were to get a college admission, it would make it easier for you. So say if somebody from the privileged class had 60 mark, and if you had 40, but you were from the underprivileged section who had been reprimanded for scores of years, you will get a privilege in terms of an admission. So this is just one of those rare things that happens, and this is a practice in India even now. There is a reservation policy in place to enable people an easier, I won't say an easier, but an equal chance into these sort of organizational spaces. Now, of course, this is looked upon as terrible from the privileged section who think that they are losing out on a chance because they have an extra privilege, right? And it might sound weird, but it's interesting how we have chosen to overlook the 200 years of deprivation that you have done against a certain caste to enable them to get this kind of a substantive equality idea. So the first picture starts with that, saying that, because of this reservation policy, everything is so difficult for the unreserved category in some sense. And thereby, Vimayana tries to contextualize the idea of caste discrimination. It says that it is within the modern context that this is happening. It is not something that used to be a reality in the past, but it is a reality today. And while it gives you these three incidents from the life of Ambedkar, it also juxtaposes it with a lot of newspaper reports, articles, sections from the Constitution, writings from Ambedkar, to sort of put these things together and again insist on the contemporaneity of the problem. The entire idea that this is in the today, in the present, and it is not a thing of the past that needs to be refuted, that needs to be not taken care of. Yeah, so Vimayana situates debates about caste discrimination and human rights in the popular cultural realm when it appropriates the comic book medium. Now, this is something that I was talking to you about how it's enabled me to have conversations about caste politics in class. And this has to do with the medium of expression rather than the content of it, is what I feel. Now, what it is also attempting to do, as I mentioned earlier, is to try and put this idea of discrimination in the global domain. And the second text that I'm looking at will sort of categorize somebody like an Ambedkar alongside people like a Rosa Parks or a Malcolm X or a Che Guevara and the others who fought for human rights in some way or the other. So you are trying to look at the idea of caste politics as the larger question of human rights in some sense, or the question of ethos and ethics in very many ways. Now, it incorporates recent newspaper articles and quotations from Ambedkar's writings and lectures to create a compelling narrative which uses texts and images. Now, again, if you go back to the previous, what lacks here is the idea of linearity. It's not left to right, left to right. It sways. It's a very river kind of a wavy kind of a narrative. It's not very difficult to read it. You get a hang of it after a couple of pages. It might seem very challenging in the beginning, but as you go along, it becomes easier. Also, those pointing fingers sort of help. They sort of guide you. If you look at there are a lot of them through the text. So the linearity is broken in very many ways, and sequential art is sort of eliminated. And this juxtaposition of newspaper reports on anti-Dalit violence in the few pages to Ambedkar's autobiographical text, official letters, extracts from the Constitution of India, constantly forces us to move from a personal life story to a larger socio-historical reality. So the fact that it nonetheless is a story of Ambedkar, but it is also a story of society in general, or historical narratives in general. Bhimayana shows the development of a strong collaboration and a unique narrative sensibility that fuses contemporary comics and traditional art. The combination of political narrative and Gond painting in Bhimayana is innovative and striking, and it uses an older art form to talk about something that is present, and it uses the local art form to talk about something that is national on the global platform. So that's the sort of narrative that is happening here. Just a second. Now, I'll take a moment to talk about the collaboration of the artists and the authors that happens. Like I mentioned, the book dedicates an entire section to the art of Bhimayana, which discusses the process of formation of the book, the artistic liberty that the Vyams had, wherein they refused to confine the characters into boxes, bringing in the idea of open art. Now, again, to go back, I will keep, or maybe I'll move into a different picture that you have here. So, and this is one of those pictures where there's a huge section from the writings of Ambedkar on the top left, top right corner, and also the speech bubbles. If you can notice the scorpion's tail and the bird that is there, and the pointing finger. So, and the refusal of sequential art. Now, that swirl pattern in between is what they call a digna. And a digna is something that is very auspicious to the Gond art. And when the Vyams initially designed the graphic novel, it was a 400-page novel, where one drawing was on one page. And it was extremely difficult to get into production. The cost would have been extremely high. So at that point, what they decided is they're going to use these dignas as what we would call the gutters in comics. The empty space between two different panels is called a gutter. So the dignas were used instead of a gutter, thereby putting pictures together, but not necessarily confining them. They are more fluid in terms of what they are trying to do. The artist also created a new font for the book, entitled it Bhim. The dialogue between the authors and the artists facilitated this, bringing back the idea of artistic collaboration, which is central to this book. Bhimayana succeeds because the art and the vision of the creators had with regard to how the text would look. in the section titled A Digna for Bhim, Anand, one of the writers, talks at length about this collaboration. While Durgabai had illustrated for some other Navayana text, this was the first time that she was working on a graphic novel. It was their willingness to work on something on a large scale that pushed Anand to get them on board for the text. They of course faced a lot of roadblocks, etc. It's also interesting to know that both the Vyams are completely unlettered, so they did not have access to letters altogether. They had to have a mediator in between, which was their daughter, to talk about what they wanted in terms of context and all of that. So Bhimayana situates debates about caste discrimination, human rights in the popular cultural domain that I spoke about. Just a moment, please. Now, I'll use, I think it's the next one. The other thing that, now it's not that this is the first text in the pictorial format that is talking about the life and struggles of Ambedkar. There have been other writings as well. And one of the more significant ones is something that is called Amar Chitra Katha, which means immortal stories in pictures. And this was a very conscious narrative, and these are the series of books on all freedom fighters that you have had in India during the colonial rule and things, so Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar alongside. But what the agenda of Amar Chitra Katha is that they try to have this iconic stature of Ambedkar or any other leader for that matter, that they need to project, that these are people that you look up to, that you sort of idealize and aspire to be like. Now, this is aimed at a very young audience. Now, I've often wondered where Bhimayana should be located, whether this can be a pedagogical tool in a classroom space for school students, or does it lose purpose? And I haven't been able to find answers. It definitely works in the undergraduate classroom, but I don't know whether it can work in a school setup. But it definitely can function as a pedagogical tool as well. Now, the reason I bring in an ACK or an Amar Chitra Katha here is because how Bhimayana is sort of different from an Amar Chitra Katha. But the fact that it tries to do away with the iconic nature of Ambedkar. And he is one of the people that he's representing. He's not a larger than life figure. So the quote unquote deification does not happen. He is somebody who's real, he's somebody who's relatable, and it doesn't take away from the greatness of the character, because there's no doubt that whatever the Dalits have been able to achieve in the last 50 years, a lot of it has been fueled by Ambedkar and his thought process. But he is nonetheless very, very tangible in his greatness as well. And he's a character not just to be revered, but also an extremely relatable one. Now, the last bit that I'll talk to you about Bhimayana is, so Ambedkar converts to Buddhism towards the later part of his life. And that's the second picture that you have there. And this is the greatest mass conversion that happens in India, where a lot of people from the Dalit community or the Ati Shudra communities alongside Ambedkar, who's their leader, convert into Buddhism. And if you see, there is an elephant, and there's something that looks like a cow or a buffalo. And that's the basic idea of Buddhism, in some way that every living being is similar or equal in very many ways. So that is what Bhimayana as a text leaves you with. And the last section, it goes back to those two people having the conversation at a bus stand, wherein there is a change in the speech bubble. So the tail of the scorpion now becomes the bird, and that is the sort of trajectory that the book takes, wherein it tells you a story, it gives you a context, it tells you the trajectory or whatever the Atishudras are going through in some sense, and gets you to understand the ideology of the text and then respond to it. And in this case, the people who listen to this story are altered in some way. They might not completely believe that caste politics and caste discrimination is a reality, but nonetheless they're willing to accept that this is a problem in some sense. And hence there is a change from a venomous speech bubble to a more peaceful, calm speech bubble of a bird in the end. So that is the regular trajectory with regard to Bhimayana and what it's trying to do in terms of visual literacy and critical literacy. I will stop here for a moment and get your questions, comments, observations. I have another text, but I don't know how much time I have. Okay. Yeah, any comments that you might have, any questions that you might have? All right. Sorry. It might be, I mean, even if it is not available online, I can share a copy. I have a PDF version, so yeah. Might not be from the rightful sources, but I have it nonetheless, yes. So this is what I was talking to you about, Navayana being the new vehicle and this entire idea of publishing only anti-caste literature. I'll quickly look at the other graphic novel as well, and I'll speed up through this and not spend enough time, because now at least you have context with regard to caste-based discrimination. The other book that I'm looking at is called The Gardener in the Wasteland, and this is about the life of somebody by the name Jyotiba Phule. I think I will have the name somewhere. Yeah, Jyotiba Phule's fight for liberty. Just give me a minute. Yeah, so Gardener in the Wasteland again is published by Navayana and written by Sri Vidya Natarajan again, but illustrated by somebody else, and you can see the difference in the illustration. This is a very modern sort of a graphic novel illustration that you have. But what I want you to notice here is the juxtaposition of the panels. The first one, which is located in the past, the second one, which is located in the present, and it's the same thing there as well. So it's a constant juxtaposition of the past and the present together, again, concentrating on the contemporary nature of the problem. Now, Phule was born in 1827 into a gardener's family, and which is where the title comes from. And it uses, this particular text uses one of Phule's books, which is called Slavery, as the base to bring in stories from histories of oppression across the world. The Gardener is a passionate book which tries to bring to the forefront an evil, which though is kept invisible, nonetheless exists. It places Jyotiba and his wife Savitri Phule alongside the revolutionaries like Thomas Paine, revolutionary thinkers like Thomas Paine, Bhagat Singh, Martin Luther King, Che Guevara, Nelson Mandela, B.R. Ambedkar. And there's a very interesting illustration that you have which says liberty, equality, fraternity, and it has all these markers for all these people whose legacy sort of Phule follows. Now, Phule's text, Slavery, lashes out on Brahminism and Hinduism, which have systematically obliterated, excluded, and exploited Shudras throughout history. The text is as relevant in contemporary India as it was when India was under colonial rule. He dedicates, it's very interesting, Ghulamgiri to the good people of the United States of America, who, as a token admiration for their sublime, disinterested, and self-sacrificing work in the cause of Negro slavery, and with an earnest desire that my countrymen may take their noble example as their guide in the emancipation of Shudra brothers from the trammels of Brahmin extremism. Now, it's interesting to note that even even within this text, the contemporary nature comes in in very many ways. The two characters, Vidya and Appu, which is Sri Vidya Natarajan and Aparajita Nainan, if you look at the second panel there, they are the ones. So they are reading Gulamgiri alongside us. So that again makes it an interesting narrative where both the reader as well as the people who are writing the text and illustrating the text are discovering Phule together. And this book is it's divided into particular sections. One which is called the Wasteland of Caste, the second which is called the Weed Bed of Myth, the Roots of Tyranny, the Seeds of Education, etc., and eventually a garden that flowers out of it. So from a very rotting space into something that flowers in the end. What is interesting with regard to Phule and Savitribai and how they differ from maybe Ambedkar is the fact that they insist on the idea of education. And they are writing at, this is at a time, 1827, 1820s, women don't have access to education in India. Primary education is denied to them, and especially for women who belong to the Atishudra class, because it's a double sort of marginalization, one based on gender, second based on caste. So at that point, Savitribai becomes one of the first teachers in India. She's educated by Jyotiba Phule, who teaches him. She's sort of a she's an equal in that relationship that they are in, and she sets out this school for people to go to, especially women to go to. And Phule is of the opinion that the only way caste discrimination can get away and can be removed from the society is with the idea of education. That education will bring in emancipation in some way, because knowledge will give you the power, and then you will have the power to sort of break down these binaries, oppositions that are there in society. And this narrative moves back and forth in time and places the problem of caste discrimination in the global narrative of trauma and violence across the world, like slavery, race-based discrimination, and places Phule alongside thinkers like Marx, Ambedkar, Martin Luther King, etc., that I spoke to you about. Natarajan and the author, Nainan, the illustrator, are characters inbuilt in the text, wherein they not only bring the sense of the contemporary, but also an idea of relatability. The readers are alongside the authors in witnessing this writing of history. The myths are carefully deconstructed and put forth a perspective that is empathetic to the marginalized. While Gulamgiri or slavery, the text arises out of a conversation between a friend and Jyotiba Phule. Gardener in the Wasteland is a conversation between Natarajan and Nainan, bringing the same idea of collaborative efforts that ease conversations and negotiations. In an afterword to the text, Natarajan talks at length about how the text was a result of collaborative process between the author and the artist. When we started working on the project, Aparajita wrote up a list of questions, the answers to which helped us work out a provisional practical formula for translating Phule's ideas into the visual form. For instance, how are we going to blend in historical and contemporary context in terms of the content of Phule's texts and in terms of presentation? Since caste oppression by no means is dead, however much the young wish to believe it, we wanted to make a point that Phule is relevant today as well. I'll show you one last picture before I end. And if you look at the first panel here, this is a poem that is there, which is called Rise to Learn and Act. But I want you to notice the number of flowers that are there in that picture. And that goes back to the idea of gardener in the wasteland, and Phule being born to a gardener, and the entire idea of what they have been able to achieve vis-a-vis education. From a wasteland, it has been converted into a garden. So that's again the trajectory of this text, that you move from a rotting place into something that flowers ideas, and flowers here are signifying of ideas, signifying of a new life, and maybe an equal society. Now, the flower motif works through the text. It's not something that comes in here, but the last panel of the text is located in the present, wherein the protagonists are reading a poem by Savitribai, shows a multitude of them, indicating the flowering of thought and the propagation of ideas. Now, when I use these two texts as instructional material in class, there are three kinds of collaborations that I'm looking at here in some sense. One, collaboration between the artists and the authors. That is the first level of it, which encourages dialogue, discussion, creating a document in that sense. The second bit of collaboration is between the reader and the text, wherein vis-a-vis the visual and the critical literacy that is being created, you sort of are engaged in learning what is coming through as the text, and perhaps open to the idea of responding to it. So it encourages an objective reading, so as to say. The third level of collaboration is using these texts in the classroom space, where it is between the instructor and the students vis-a-vis the vehicle of the text, and how does that collaboration happen, and what comes out of that collaboration that is of interest to me as well. And it's interesting to also notice that it is this sort of collaboration that we're looking at a microcosmic level. If we look at it at the macrocosmic level, that'll help aid towards the working of an egalitarian society, because conversations are most important around these, and that is what these particular texts are trying to talk about. They're trying to talk about or initiate a kind of conversation around the problems, because unless there is a dialogue, you're not arriving at anything. It's a one-way traffic does not necessarily work with regard to words. So I'll just end with this, that the Gardner and Bimayana both make an attempt to write history. Their approach is pedagogic, and they bring the idea of writing history differently and the possibility of multiple truths. They bring in the idea of caste-based discrimination of the contemporary with the framed narrative, and the entire idea with regard to collaboration and conversation. Okay, that also wants me to stop, basically. So that's all right. So the text uses the global format of the graphic novel to talk about a national signifier, and the national signifier being caste here. And it brings an innovative idea of interrogating and looking at caste in some sense within the global landscape of memory. And the location of the text, the uses of other media, whether it's biographies, newspaper articles, brings in the idea of the contemporary, the entire idea of critical literacy, visual literacy that I was talking to you about. Yeah, and hopefully that they are able to bridge the gap and make the issue and the texts more relatable. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you. It was very, very nice and interesting. I want to ask you what languages are used in these graphic novels.
English.
Only English.
Yes. Yes.
And does it have impact on the people in India when it's just in English?
See, that's where this entire idea of pedagogy and me not being able to arrive whether this can be used in a school classroom has been challenging. Because the other thing that I was talking to you about, Amar Chitra Katha, they come out in the vernacular languages as well. This is originally in English, but I understand that there are translations available. Initially came out in English as a language, but it has been translated into other vernacular languages as well. So there is availability of it, but the original is in the English.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
May I ask a question? And I have a slightly different question. I'm also curious to know whether it's originally in English.
It is. Yeah.
So thank you for your answer. And I have another question. Is it a brand new media in history of India? Because, for instance, in the European tradition, we have something like a Biblia Pauperum. It's a Bible for, let's say, uneducated. So there was a lot of pictures, illustrations, and only a few pieces of text, a few lines. Do you have something like that also in India, or is it just a brand new media you are using in nowadays? Thank you.
Yeah, so religious texts have been available in the pictorial format as well. I mean, that's been there. That's been a tradition that has been there. What I look at as the graphic novel now, maybe 2000. That's where the first quote-unquote Indian graphic novel comes out. So it's only been about 20 years. With regard to the graphic novel format, there have been depictions, like Amar Chitrakatha is 1950s onwards, just after the independence struggle. So they've been publishing for the last 70 odd years. And yeah, picture books have been available, like you said, for the Bible. So for the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, which are the epics in India, there have been pictorial representations of them which have been there. But the graphic novel format is a fairly new one. It's about 2.5 decades old. Yeah.
When I said that I never read a graphic novel, I was maybe wrong, because I don't know if what the genre is. Maybe not students, but the academics knows the books. It's usually paperback, which presents one of the authors or one of the sciences. It looks precisely like that, but
absolutely.
I don't know if it's graphic. I wouldn't call it novel.
Yeah, you wouldn't call it graphic. It's a graphic narrative in that sense. Yeah.
So that's the right.
Yes,
that's the right
a narrative.
term.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
No problem.
So I have read several of them. I like them.
Okay, we still have, let's say, one simple question. I lost the line right now. No, no. When speaking about, let's say, new media, if the graphic novel is a new media, how does it work on social media? Is it also a phenomenon here in your country? Does it work on social media, like
does the graphic
Instagram?
novel work on social media?
Our social media are full of graphic content, dealing with not like a cartoons, but really for adults and for educational purposes. Does it work also this way? Is this publication house active in that field?
No, not this. Navayana definitely doesn't do a lot of social media thing. I mean, they do organize talks and things like that. That's about it. This material is not available on social media, but there are other people who are constantly, there are other Gond artists or other tribal artists who have had some sort of education in the cities and cosmopolitan towns and who know how to use the new media, and they constantly are publishing their work. So that does happen, not this particular publishing house for that matter, yeah. But there is a visibility of graphic narratives in the social media as well.
Let's conclude this morning lecture. Thank you very much once again, Paramita. And I ask you for an applause once again. Thank you. And the next lecture starts at 9:50. So 9:50.
Again, good morning to everyone. After this passionate lecture of my colleague, now it's high time I started and complete the third part of my presentations, and I hope that you enjoy it. Just to stick to the previous one, we are organized in the Kolb cycle. So we already started with the concrete experience, and we moved to reflective observation, and now we'll discuss some issues connected to reflection. I'll just briefly introduce you with two concepts that might be, in some way, they might be familiar. If not, I hope they'll help you to understand that society and discourse in society, it's a matter of contingency. So there are two basic concepts that I would like to draw through the course of this presentation. The first one is antagonism. We intuitionally, we know what means that something is antagonistic. If we got two colleagues, two friends, and they're arguing with each other, there is this tension. If there is a couple and he wants to watch the match, she wants to watch the movie, the soap opera or something, there is a tension. So first I'll start with a concept introduced in late 80s. That was the year of my birth. Ernest Laclau, Chantal Mouffe, also a couple. He passed away, she's still a monk among us. They introduced the term antagonism, which means some kind of a confrontation. And I'm quoting here confrontation between non-negotiable moral values or essential forms of identification. This type of confrontation results in a state of hostile relations. It means that if we've got an antagonistic approach, antagonistic situation, antagonistic context, one party is ready to treat the other one as hostile, as a threat, sometimes refuses even a matter of being. So if I don't like someone, it doesn't mean that I can't stand with the person. Within the antagonistic approach, that's exactly the case. And in contrary to antagonism, which is so popular and so common among people and also in society, there's also a contradictory approach, something which Chantal Mouffe called agonism. This is the better option. Both approaches are based on Marxism, they're post-structural Marxist approaches, so she thinks that society is always based on conflict. If you don't agree, that's of course your opinion. Within this approach, there is this tension that there must be a social conflict. Between different parties, there are always different values, and those values are arguing with each other and they're struggling with each other, and someone is looking for dominance. Someone would like to establish his thought, his way of living, his opinion as the dominant, the righteous one. And when there's agonism, it doesn't mean that the foolish party needs to be annihilated. There's something else. The foolish party, or the party that was not the successful one, can go on without any problems, respecting that there is another dominant narrative. And normally we think that democracy is healthy when society, parties are agonistic. It means that who wins election rules. And others are, of course, against the party and against ideas of the rulers, of authorities, but they respect that there are the undaunted, there are the chosen authorities. So we've got agonism when two parties can get along, and we've got antagonism where we've got actually two opposite parties that are struggling with each other. And I will provide you with a clip, because I like clips. I think you will understand more through watching this kind of series. And then, of course, we'll see two clips, short parts of them. and then I'll raise a question. You will answer the question like yesterday, so through digital communication.
In 1969, Paul VI replaced the traditional Latin Mass in Vatican II churches with his own creation, the New Mass, or Novus Ordo. Since that time, the world has seen the following in the Vatican II churches, which celebrate the New Mass, or Novus Ordo. The world has seen clown masses in which the, quote, priest dresses as a clown in utter mockery of God. The world has seen priests dress as Dracula in football jerseys accompanied by cheerleaders as a cheesehead. There have been disco masses, gymnastic performances during the New Mass, balloon masses, carnival masses, nude masses, at which scantily clad or nude people take part. And we have seen juggling masses at which a juggler performs during the New Mass. The world has seen priests celebrate the New Mass with Dorito chips, with Mountain Dew, on a cardboard box, with cookies, with Chinese tea accompanied by ancestor worship, with a basketball as a priest bounces it all over the altar, with a guitar as the priest plays a solo performance. The world has witnessed the New Mass with a priest almost totally nude as he dances around the altar, with priests dressed in native pagan costumes, with a Jewish menorah placed on the altar, with a statue of Buddha on the altar, with nuns making offerings to female goddesses, with lectors and gift bearers dressed up as voodoo Satanists. The world has seen the New Mass at which the performer is dressed up in a tuxedo and tells jokes. The world has seen rock concerts at the New Mass, guitar and polka New Masses, a puppet New Mass, a New Mass where the people gather around the altar.
As you can see, it's a collection of pictures. Sometimes they're even not from the Mass, just from social events with church representatives. But, of course, there is a very intensive thesis that we replace the Holy Mass, and we've got an event Mass, something like this. And in the background, still the Latin old type of music for church. And now there, through the course of this clip, there is a comparison with the Mass that actually was replaced. Of course, it goes on and goes on. That's the first clip. Now we'll see the second one.
Thanks to the magic of social media to enhance our social lives and give us a sense of community, I was reminded this week about one of the persistent ongoing conflicts in the life of the church between modernist and orthodox factions after I posted something about how the preservation of doctrine is essential to promote and preserve the sense of community and culture in the life of the church. And someone replied to that by saying,
So we've got the second clip with a talking head explaining why there's no contradiction between the old and new Mass, and that there is something wrong in the first approach. You get two different clips, and now I'll ask you to fulfill the question. Of course, we'll start with the basic. So we'll go to the web page, like yesterday, one of my projects web page, and I'll ask you to click the task number 1. When you click the task number 1 from the web page, here you go, the address, it's Papal Authority. Then you'll see the question, which is in some way very personal. Of course, I respect that all of you answer this question showing the anonymity, so there's no name, nickname, and so on. Which approach is better for you? The one from the first clip or the one from the second? And why? If you're not Christian, you're not related to this kind of stuff, this kind of things, just try to figure out which one is better for healthy society. Healthy means the society that people respect each other, and you can be part of this huge, massive cohort, respecting that there are people like you outside the particular church, and there are people from this or that church. If you put the first or the second, just try to answer why. Reflect the past of your experience, your current experiences with people from different religious backgrounds, and of course, what would be better for the future. I'll give you 1 to 3 minutes, and then we'll try to reflect this issue. I don't see a grounded explanation why, so at least one explanation would be helpful. Okay, so because you follow a slightly different way than I approach in the beginning, we've got one explanation. I'll try to figure out or show you that what we already done, or this thing we did, that's exactly the way we're articulating our position within the social discourse. A position means your statement and your discourse and your ideas, your values, your approach. You said one or number two because this, because that. That's a very profound statement. It's like, I love Coca-Cola. I don't like, you got this Czechs one, Kofola. Yeah? It's just a statement. We're in the local environment, you listen to that, and you can face the problem and say, because you're not Czechs, if you were Czech, it means that you would be able to delight and to figure out why this one is better. And now we've got discourse. So this articulation showed, at least on a macro contextual and a macro textual level, it shows that we have our preferences. First row and consecutive lines show that we feel better with this or that, with no explanation. And then we've got a very profound statement, even if. So I'm an atheist, there is the atheistic approach, so I'm not the party, I'm from outside the business, which is very important to say that in the beginning. But, and this but is always the thing that reverses the conversation and the dominant discourse. The second one is better because. So I'm not part of it, but there is one that is better. It's a very simple way of showing how those discourse work. And the ultimate argument, mocking. This kind of mocking is enough. In the beginning we show that there is something else, that someone said, the second one is at least clear. I think that the first one was very clear, using this narrative that this but that, this and that, good, bad. We call that approaching or establishing bad agent. So the new mass was the bad agent of change, and of course those who were responsible for establishing this kind of business, Pope and his bishops. You saw John Paul II, you saw Cardinal Bergoglio, and so on. The second is out of date for today's society. The second shows the, let's say, societal approach from the last 20 years, at least till after the past of communist regime, where we were ready to discuss different approaches and find place for ourselves in society. And now something changed. Some scholars call that the illiberal turn, that the more critical you are, the more rigorous you are, the better is your position. Of course, we don't accept this kind of issues, especially among academics and at the university. But outside the building, people are eager to do so. They just love to be anti, against, pro, and so on. So agonistic approach, where there's part for everyone, is in a backslide. And we are facing the problem of increasing antagonism. Now I'll try to show you that there are different types of people who are parts of this business. And because we're mostly digital users, we're media users, not just media readers, media listeners, but users, hybrid or digital media users, there is a very nice typology proposed by Jim-Yong Kim in 2018, showing that we've got at least 5 simple types of people using media. And probably you will find yourself, and you could define you as some part of this sack. The first one is impression management type. So people are eager to access restriction and communicating to others through private media, because they believe that public communication on internet brings this kind of surveillance and tension that it's problematic. They won't be punished in future. Then there's the lurk type, which is particular for everyone who just switch this and that channel. And I believe that most of us, we're lurks during lectures. Of course, you're listening to, you're making some reflections, you're taking notes, and at once you're switching immediately to your Facebook, to your Instagram account, to some news app, and then you're getting bad, and you're switching again and getting back. It's very typical where people are deeply grounded mostly on social media and in digital media instead of traditional media. Then we've got social network enjoyer and a relationship type. And this functions slightly different because there are some people's interests that they are mad about. And those people love to share themselves on web page, on the internet, through social media, showing or exhibiting their hobbies and so on. And the last one is social value orientational type. And this function in a slightly oldish way, I would say. First of all, if I want to say something publicly, let's say through Facebook, or I want to be quoted on some forums, I have this kind of obligation to use my name and surname. I want to be public, and I want my voice to be a real voice. So there's a very coherent perspective of me on the internet, my avatar, and me in the real life, which sometimes is not so obvious. Try to figure out whether you are coherent and stable. You are a very shy person in real situations and devil of social media. It's possible, because social media brings people option to be very paranoid in that sense. So we are experiencing some typical types of being in social media in general, on the internet, in digital sphere. And now I want you to put that to your online communities, because you are making those communities. They're not like typical groups. We know from sociology that groups are basically focused on having shared interest and very common protected values. If you are searching through the net and you're getting access to some forums or some hidden groups, you're becoming part of the social community, which is driven just for online purposes, but of course the repercussions are online and offline, or there are hybrid. And the way we are celebrating our presence and the way we are going on with this kind of business is mostly connected to our media diet. It means that there's some portion of information or media content that it's our feed. We use it as normal food, and we're providing that each day on a regular basis to have a very specific type of environment. Some people are very well informed, others, they are out. There's even a FOMO, a specific type of disorder that people fear very unpleasant, and they are not comfortable with being out of contact with others through digital media. And I've got a short puzzle for you. It's a Q methodology table, which normally is used for expressing people's approach to media and the way they're articulating their usage of media. It's a very simple psychological table used for media scholars, and now we'll try to fill the table collectively, which in some ways is not canonical, but I think it'll help us to understand what's the basic, what's the main ingredient of our digital or normal media diet. That's the table. We start here. There's a column where we have to put the most important media we're using or we use on a daily basis. And my question to you is, which type of this media, which one particular medium is the one, the top for you? That's a very basic question. Just don't raise hand, just say this exactly. Say TV, radio, online, digital media or something. Which one?
Online digital media.
Online digital media. Do everyone agrees? Sorry, does everyone agree?
What's the difference between online digital media and app?
Yeah, I distinct. Online digital media sometimes is a newspaper on the internet. Yeah, that might be a web page, that might be news portal. And if we're using apps, now it's something different. It's, let's say we're having a Google app, because apps are designed to perfectly deliver us this kind of information and content that might be from our filter bubble. On the internet, when you switch on the most popular web page in Poland, it'll be onet.pl. In England, that might be BBC or Guardian. So you have a lot of informations, and those pieces of information are not focused and targeted especially on you, while apps are perfectly targeted just to your interests. So online, I'll put this one here. What next? What's the second? Radio.
Thank you. Radio, but it would be, excuse me, radio, but online radio.
Online radio, okay. So, do you agree with him that radio is the typical part of your media diet? I see that people are disagreeing. Yeah. Okay, you have your own cars? Not yet, some of you. And of course, if you've got car, radio is so typical. But if not radio and not on online digital media, what else? Do you use printed media? No. Do you watch television? A lot of television. Do you provide, are you receiving information from television? So let's say you watch the news. Who watches the news on television? Raise your hand. Just, oh my. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 people, 7, 8, 9. Sorry, I think it's not enough. We can put that here. Sorry, not radio. That's the problem with filling the table collectively, of course. When you've got, if any of you will fill the table independently, and then I'll ask another and another person, it's just a table. But the very important thing is not what is there, but what's the argument for putting this exactly medium to that row. So we see that television might be here or there, but of course it's highly controversial. do you use apps for receiving news? Okay, I see that there's a lot of options for apps. Oh, you see. We see there's some general pattern that digital media gives you content. Sometimes it's content created by traditional media, that they're also hybrid. And the question is whether you are targeted on qualitative content. Quality means that it's a content. Firstly, the content you have to pay for, because qualitative information is not a free available information. So my general question, who of you pays for access to news? And that's the question mostly to students. No one. Okay, yeah. It's a very generic question and it shows the tendency. Then we need to put something here and there. So we'll just focus on the first row when we've got online digital media. And because predominantly you were into this one type of media, I'll ask you which one is the most important for you. Of course, online digital media, that might be also social media which is providing you news, sometimes stolen from qualitative media, sometimes just copied because it was online. Probably it's not Česká televize. And I had a problem with radio station, radio broadcasting in Czechia, so I thought maybe this rock radio might be something nice, but I don't know it. Sorry for it. Okay. Facebook, Twitter, Google News. Twitter. And you guys?
I'm just about to retire.
Which platform is the most important for you?
I wouldn't go that far and like call them important. I don't get them as important.
Yeah, of course. Important here means the one that you are using often on your regular basis, the one that is the primary source of information. So maybe not important in terms of your attitude, because I don't like Facebook, but Facebook and email box, those are two sources of my two important sources of academic information. I receive emails and I receive posts, posters and links through Facebook. That's the reason I have got my Facebook account. So maybe not important, but normal, regular for you. Yeah?
I mean, maybe I'm not the right person to answer.
Maybe
this
you're
question.
not, yeah. I think that everyone born before 1995 here represent a minority group. So this minority interests are always different. What's your? Yeah.
Was mine?
Yeah.
Okay. Mine is I think Twitter, and I think Česká televize is not something you should completely forget about.
So I'll put Twitter here with this. Yeah, and yours?
I'm just a minority.
Okay.
You
It
should
might be
ask
a
me.
web page. Do you got some web page in Czechia that is very popular?
One from like Česká televize, ČT24, which have some digital news, like news website.
Okay.
And I think it's most of us our primary source of information.
Normally it takes me 20 to 30 minutes to talk to someone, and I've got those labels, names of television, of radio broadcasters and so on. So it's easier for people to just put some name to the table and articulate why this one is important and why this exactly this one that I have in my hand is there on the first position and there another position. This short puzzle was just to show you one thing, which is very important in terms of our being or digital thrownness, like says Amanda Lagerqvist. We're thrown into digital media and we're consuming very less. We're consuming not enough. And the media diet, which is part of our life, which is full of our emotions and which is fulfilling our brains, this media diet is unfortunately very weak. So you know, when there's a very weak media diet, there's a regular option that we can suppose antagonism will increase because people don't get enough information. If you are a diverse user, let's say, because you are merging online sources with radio and so on, you're exquisite. It means that you're part of this noble informational users, but they're very rare. There is a very nice book about Catholic communities online. I strongly recommend you to read Marta Kołodziejska, my colleague's book, which shows a bottom-up approach to reflect religious authority. And one of the very basic concepts provided and tested in this book is that knowledge and reflexivity are not typical for Catholic media users because in terms of on a regular basis, because they represent non-mainstream experience. So you go to the church, you listen to the sermon, let's say that you've got some paper news or paper magazine about church life and so on. That's another part of business. What's online is a totally different world. On the one hand, this world is based on individuality and people's approach to understand what's going on. On the other hand, this world finished or is completed with banal religion. There is no option for ultimate authority. You know that if the authority is not for me, there's something wrong within it, I can always change the authority or I can replace it. Here you got traditional holy objects like rosary, like books, and of course some CD discs regarding information and knowledge about Catholicism. And I wanted to stress that if you're part of the Catholic Church, you probably are in one of two routes, but those routes are very diverse. The traditional one, which is highly technically capable. It means that people who are from this route, they know how to use digital media, and they try to supplement their digital media diet with traditional media diet. And there's another route which is I call that post-Vatican II. So normal Catholics that go to church in their local language, go for a mass in their local language, and they represent different type of experience. Their experience is much more defragmented and focus on digital objects. So they don't want to get an in-depth information about their religion if they're not expert in the field. An expert in the field means someone who will be a professional teacher or lecturer in theology, someone who wants to be a nun or a priest. So these people are supposed to ground their knowledge. And their knowledge about Catholicism is broader than traditional Catholics that are just part of the business and they're using Catholic media. For them, it's part of social event, and content about Catholicism is just something that helps them to understand what's going on in the church. And now I'll change to media resources in terms of the process of changes in understanding what's important here and how does church evaluate and evolve in terms of different media revolutions. With my colleague from theology, he's professor of Catholic theology, we started a project, religious authority transformed by changes in communication. And we took into account Newman's approach that there is such a thing like a development of a doctrine. Of course, I treat here doctrine in an intuitive sense to show that there is a growth of formulation which can focus on content of the dogma. So we've got some dogmas and we are trying to re-articulate those dogmas in different ways. And we call that dogmatic breakthroughs. It means that there were some important moments, sometimes not just one moment, but periods, that they change, they switch the narrative. And if I get back to the antagonistic and agonistic approach, I would say that we had some discourse in the church about religion and what's holy, what's sacred, where's the rule of the church. And in some particular moment of history, we switch to another one. And we see that there are three in terms of communication. So it's not a theological understanding, it's more or less media-grounded social understanding and historical understanding of religious issues or theological issues. So it's slightly combined and different approach. Here's my argument. There are three fundamental changes in the history of Catholic Church, and they sparked a dynamic internal dispute over the future of doctrine. So there was a switch of the doctrine and the way of articulating faith. Dogma is always to say that we believe in something like this. But of course, in different periods of church life, people believe differently. So their articulating on dogma was different. There were different options to say the same thing, like the riots about nature of Christ in the 3rd century and 5th century. They were different. They knew that Christ is the same in two persons. And I think yesterday or 2 days ago we had this example through the lecture of my colleague from Macedonia. So we've noticed there are three breakouts. First, that's the Council of Nicaea, the Nicene Council, then Luther's Revolution, and we regard that as Catholic in terms that something happened in the Christian society, and then we had serious repercussions also in the Catholic Church, which stayed apart from the Lutheran community, and the Second Vatican Council, and the process started in the Second Vatican Council and is completed, or it's being completed by Pope Francis. So I approach that Francis is the only Pope of the Council, in the terms that he's the first Pope who has not been part of this community, because John Paul II and of course Benedict XVI, they were on the council. But he's the one that actually understands what's going on within the text and what's maybe not the spirit of the council, but where's the next step of this pastoral meeting of bishops. We'll start with a video.
This council was also going to formalize how the liturgy was given, provide rules for the structure of the church, and set down some guidelines for being a priest. No living in the houses of young women, no self-castration, no engaging in usury, that sort of thing. But above all, they were there to deal with one thing, the Arian heresy. This was the main topic, the front and center issue that everybody had come to discuss. It was tearing apart the Christian world, and it was time it came to an end. So 318 bishops assembled in one late spring, 325 CE, in the coastal Anatolian town of Nicaea to settle this once and for all. The conference center was arrayed in splendor by the emperor. The bishops and all their aides and advisors were guests of the empire, housed, fed, and cared for at imperial expense. But more than that, the emperor himself would be in attendance. That's just how important this was to Constantine. Constantine set the tone for the meeting, walking in not surrounded by guards, as was the norm for the person of the emperor, but rather entering surrounded only by a few friends. This wasn't a battle, it was a time to come together. And so it began. The debate was vigorous, using all the rhetorical art the Roman world was famous for. Laity and clerics both engaged in arguing the merits of each side, while the emperor sat there, gently reminding everyone that they were all Christians here and that they needn't treat each other like enemies of the faith. And for weeks the discussions went on, contentious, impassioned, on at least one occasion breaking out into a brawl. But for all this, the truth was that most of the bishops were relatively moderate, looking to come to the correct answer, but believing that an answer could be found that both sides could agree to. And the emperor himself was happy to embrace anything that would just get all these guys to agree. So the discussions really resolved down to the points of view of two men. Arius, the namesake of Arianism, whose unbending views had caused the council to be summoned in the first place, and a man named Athanasius. Athanasius was a deacon of Alexandria, where the whole Arian schism began. He was an ardent anti-Arian, and he intended to do everything in his power to make sure that no compromise with the Arians was reached. And so time rolled forward with the council split, no overwhelming majority willing to come down on either side. Debate continued on how to achieve a compromise position, but the discussion wound in circles as these two men, Athanasius and Arius, dominated the discussion and kept any chance of truly finding middle ground at bay. Still, time and again, the emperor reminded them all that they were here to heal the church, that as Romans and as Christians, they were more alike than different, and that they should be able to find a way to work such esoteric theological differences out. But Constantine, powerful, intelligent, and adroit as he was not the type of subtle theologian that Athanasius turned out to be. Because as the debate moved on, Athanasius began to introduce...
I'll stop here because I don't want to be run out of time. You see that they're talking about issues, and of course it's a funny cartoon about the council, but there's the first breakthrough. We have a credo. There were many local credos for them, dozens, and they were using this and that, but for the church, nothing such important like a piece of paper. That moment was the ultimate moment that they decided there is homoousios, the word which was the key word to understand Christian nature, the Christ nature. And that was the moment that actually what was written was the source of, maybe not the nodal point, but a point of orientation. So we got the first breakthrough, and we see that it's a piece of paper with some text. So now the doctrine is becoming an interpretation of a concrete text. Not just the Bible and so on, but the text that is canonical for the whole church. Then we've got, that's the first breakthrough. So creed is a written text. Then we've got the second one. It's Martin Luther's riot and his revolution. Luther said, we got the text. The interpretation is within the church, is according to church rules. Now, I can provide my own interpretation, which will be labeled Luther's work. And probably you don't know that Martin Luther was the first person who made a world-famous branch, because he was writing a lot, firstly to Pope Leo 10th, My Most Blessed Father Leo, Beatissime Padri Leone. And then he completed his works with the Pope, this devil in Rome. So there is a huge antagonism, but in the beginning that was just a question, a polite request and obligation to set up some kind of a debate. Written text is interpreted contextually. That's Luther's work. So we can use the Bible and the Holy Scripture to understand our current condition without the institutional approach and without the approval of the Holy Catholic Church. That's the second breakthrough. And the third one, the second was Luther. Oh, I think I dropped somewhere in my slides. So the third one, it's that within the Catholic Church, we have the same kind of situation, that finally we interpret dogmas contextually. It means that the Church opens for other religions, which might sound creepy for representatives of those religions. Church open for women, although it's not so stressed so radically. There are many options for that. And the first very important option is that contemporary society or the current conditions of our living are contextual. It means that in some way they are not stable. So we are starting with text as a very basic nodal point and point of orientation. Then some parts of the community says, now we can to interpret this text freely. And ultimately we notice that the other part of the community opens itself for freely interpretations. And it brings attention and it brings option for collapse or at least collision, because for one part of this community we will have just agonistic situation. There are different interpretations and we can get along with that and we can live in a peace. For other parts there is no option for different interpretations, because there's just one truth, and this one truth is in the box, and the box is hidden in Rome, in the Vatican, very colloquially meaning. Now, patterns of media consumption. To complete my lecture, you saw that there are different steps of approaching doctrine through media content. Before I said that there are different options for being a media user. I'll try to combine what's going on in terms of believers, Catholics, those who are traditionalists and those who are, let's say, post-Vatican Catholics. I conducted a study with 30 people representing those two groups. And eventually I've noticed that there are some patterns of media consumptions in terms of discussing and negotiating papal authority, especially Pope Francis. And I call them, like in Harry Potter, negotiators, descriptors, contesters. There are two issues helping me in describing those groups, those patterns. The first one is the type of media consumption. The second one is the level of social reflexivity. So we had a short passage about reflective thinking. Here you go, matrix of those two. There are some media users who are using especially digital platforms. There are, let's say that we are on the column with traditional Catholics. Highly reflective users. You see that negotiators and contesters are highly reflective. So they get news and they try to reflect what's going on in terms of their past and future experience. They're different because contesters are mainly those from digital media. So we know that people who are doing those memes and very offensive cartoons, they might be part of this contesting movement, grounded deeply and thrown into digital media. Negotiators, in some ways, they're using digital media as the primary source of their informations, but they're also supplement their newsfeed with traditional media, traditional content media. Sorry, not content, but quality media, let's say the paid media. And we've got descriptors. And probably you know at least one descriptor among you. It's a person that watches news, watches something, see a clip, surf the net, and then just describe. Oh, funny moment about the Pope, and nothing else. There's little reflection. And we've got the post-Vatican Catholics. Maybe some of you are part of this cohort, which is also diverse. And I don't know why, I tried to find those patterns and always I looked for 2, 4, eventually I've got 3 and 3. Digital followers. They use only digital media. In some way they are reflective. They're optimists in terms of Pope Francis. Hybrid followers, they're pretty the same with one exemption. Sometimes they supplement their digital newsfeed with traditional media. And there are supporters. And I wish you being this part of the business, because supporters are highly reflective and they use a variety of traditional and digital media. Sometimes they get even an international media newsfeed. It means that when Pope Francis does something against the traditional doctrine, let's say he says, "Who am I to judge?" They just don't see that. They try to figure out what's going on through different channels of communication, and then they incorporate this knowledge to their approach to their life and so on. So, as you see, contesters and supporters, 2 contradictory groups. They're different not only because they represent different values, but mostly they're different because they use different media. If you're deeply in digital media without no quality content from outside this world, you are probably one of those who might be misled. Just to collect everything and connect with roles and types of authorities, I'll focus on 2 things. Supporters, they like power. So authority is for ruling, and that's their decision that they're looking for authority that will guide them in their life. While contesters, they also do the same, but you see that the authority is to contest its position. So they would like to have an authority that would lead them in their life. In terms of descriptors, they're mostly passive. What they get, that they think. And it's in some way sad. Okay, that's everything from my side. Thank you very much.
Shame, because it seems to me that according to your presentation, it's not so, I'm sorry too sexy to be only online and to be. It doesn't mean that I'm progressive. It means that the diversity is what is expected from us as a, let's say, contemporary modern men and women. Am I right? Is this the conclusion I can take from your presentation?
I think that there is just one conclusion, that quality does matter, and just digital newsfeed doesn't provide enough quality.
If I'm right, you said that instant isn't quality. Like, instant doesn't mean quality.
Yeah. Instant in general doesn't mean quality, but in terms of media, it might be qualitative, but mostly it's not. And when we try to figure out what's exactly the quality of instant media or instant media diet, then we see that it's weak.
I didn't want it to tell during the presentation, but as a Ukrainian, I use an app to get information, because we have this time so much information, so we use instant apps to have this information. I use Telegram app, and it has channels and which are verified. So I think this verification of some governmental media who uses instant apps to provide some information can be quality. What do you think?
Yeah, when I think about quality, I'm thinking about rich and complete information. And you're a special case. In at least it's twofold. First one, because it's a war, we know that there are extra measurements and extra conditions. And truth and access to quality, it's much more difficult, at least in terms of propaganda, war propaganda, which is part of the business on all sides of the conflict. So with my students from Ukraine, we saw first bombings from Kiev, and those coverages were used in 2014, I think, but originally they were taken in Beirut years ago. So of course we know that there's no, it's not so easy to distinguish between truth and disinformation, even if some things are checked, yeah, because it's war. And the second issue, yesterday during the conversation about conspiracy theories, I should have raised my hand, but there were no time for that. I think that there is a quality difference between different nations, and some layers and notions should be firstly grounded in local context and then analyzed and discussed. And I believe that everything that starts in Lviv and goes to even Moscow and further, it's another mindset, because you are multilingual from ages. You are extremely flexible in terms of migrations and so on. And at once, level of social trust is none there, because there's no option for regular and good institutions when the level of corruption is very high, like we had that before few years ago, and now when there's just an option for survival. So in some ways, Ukraine is special now, and we will see after years what was true, what's not, maybe not. And you don't have option to get quality information on a regular basis. I was conducting a survey with, and my analysis with people that they were far away from the war perspective. War is changing everything.
This is absolutely true. I think the main point is that we as a nation don't have a culture of fact-checking and believe everything.
Yeah, you don't have, that's one side of the business. On the other side, past Soviet nations are highly reflective in terms of their distrust to social institutions. And there is another problem, this war and the authoritarian regime of the current president. We means authoritarian because he's unitarizing the country and he's slaughtering opposition in terms of war and so on, which is a fact publicly known. That'll finish. If after the war, I know there won't be any option for regional information in the country. We had a PhD student in Katowice a few years ago. She was dealing with regional and local media on Ukraine. And her PhD was stopped because all of those media outlets, they were closed or taken over, and situation changed dramatically. It is like now everyone will close your media in the region and you don't have regular access to information. Yeah.
I guess the generation has changed, and people same age as me or my parents wouldn't believe something that TV said.
Oh yeah.
That's that. Like I guess generation has changed and fact-checking culture is improving.
That's very good that we don't believe media. We have to reflect the information we get. And of course, yeah, post-Soviet countries are much more reflective in terms of what they get. Yeah.
Thank you.
Only 10 minutes to switch the lecture, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
For your questions, also for your comments. I think it's an excellent conclusion of your discussion part. It's a good news that we don't trust media. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
let me introduce you one of my friends. I also met her in the US on the summer school, as I have already told you a week ago when I invited my friend from Pakistan. So Monica is also familiar with him. So this is my friend Monica from Łódź, from Poland, from the Department of Pragmatics, but the Institute of English Language and Literature and Faculty of Arts. Okay, so she's a lover of Africa, so I would expect something concerning zebras, because as you can notice, she always wears something which reminds of a zebra pattern. So, floor is yours. And
yes, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for invitation. It's really pleasure and honor to be here. And it's also very interesting for me that it's that I'm here at the Faculty of Theology, talking about media and ethics in a way. I'm going to talk about international journalism. And as you can guess, after the short introduction, I'm going to talk a lot or give as a case in point Africa. So there'll be references to Africa and how Africa is covered. In my research, as Renata said, I am in the Department of Pragmatics, and in my research I'm interested in media in the context of conflict and media in the context of religion, and also in intercultural communication. So I'm kind of trying to combine these two or three strands in a way. I've been developing an approach, a theoretical approach, to news coverage, or more generally media effects, which I'm going to present today. Just a few, or a very short word of introduction, because it's the International Teaching Week. So I thought I would just tell you 3 words about where I am from. I'm from Łódź, which is in the center of Poland. 3rd largest city, or maybe 4th, still 3rd probably, largest city. The interesting thing about city, which has this kind of still, I would say, industrial atmosphere or look, is that it is referred to, and it was referred to, as city of 4 cultures: German, Jewish, Russian, and Polish, when it started as textile industry city and developed in the 19th century as promised land. So these 4 cultures were dominant then, and now we are trying to, I think, somehow elaborate or to commemorate somehow this heritage that we have, this cultural heritage. The University of Łódź is quite active internationally, and I'm saying this to perhaps encourage you to come within Erasmus when we establish it, even though we don't have at our university the Faculty of Theology. So it's like a separate institution, if you like. But we have the Faculty of Philology, which is where I'm from. Now, before I tell you the story, why Africa, just 2 slides with basic assumptions. which I find very important and which I think explain the power of the media. I think the power of the media can be explained in two ways. Whatever media we are talking about, whether these are mainstream media, whether these are traditional media, or the new media, social media. The first thing is the power of language itself, and I'm a constructivist by nature, so believing that language constructs the reality in which we live. But what media adds to this, they add the, global access or the global reach to these linguistically constructed images of the world. One of the sociologists, John Arry, said that people in general, we as people, we need proximity, we need closeness. We need closeness with other people in face-to-face interactions. We need closeness with, so proximity with events in face-to-event interactions. And we need closeness with places. That's why we travel, that's why we visit places. Two researchers who are interested in television and how television works called the same, let's say, phenomenon compulsion of proximity. Yeah, that we really need this proximity. And I think the power of the media, and I think we had an excellent, say, opportunity, whether we wanted it or not, to realize that during the pandemic, where most of our interactions with people, with places, with events were mediated by the media, just moved online because we were locked in our houses, in our homes. So I will come back to this concept during my talk, to this concept of proximity, closeness. Now, there is one of my favorite statements about the media that you might be familiar with, is what Liebman said years ago, namely that media create images, pictures of things, pictures in our minds, of things that we cannot see directly, places we cannot visit, people we cannot, situations we cannot participate in directly. That's why I put the heading news images, not only from the world, because what we get in the news are images from the world, but these are very often images of the world that media create in our minds. Back in the 90s, where there was emphasis on television studies when it comes to the media, Thompson said that something similar in a way, that most of our experience of distant places, events, is mediated by the institutions of mass communication. And in a way, the media, journalists in the media, create context in which context for us to understand what is happening, and in this way create the images of these places in our minds. And now why Africa? Why did I get interested in Africa? Years ago, when I had the impression that my whole life collapsed, I decided to buy a ticket. I just bought a ticket and went off to Kenya, actually, and then ended up in Tanzania at a Franciscan mission, staying there for 2 months and teaching, helping in school, kindergarten, etc. But when I was going there, at the time I was writing my PhD on television news. When I was going there, people kept asking, aren't you afraid? to go to Africa on your own. You may be raped, you may be robbed, you may even be killed. It's a really dangerous place to go. And then when I came back from Africa, people kept asking me, do they wear shoes? People there, did you see these starving children with swollen bellies in the streets? And I started wondering where we get these images from and how they are created in our minds. It was 2005, so years ago. Now I think the situation is a bit different with social media. I think there is, even if not enough, then there is more Africa, if you like, in the media. But at that time I started wondering, okay, where do we have these images from? And it's not only about Africa, you could say it's about Global South in general. It's about all the places we don't have direct access to, or events we don't have access to. And then I decided at the time to add, to the horror of my supervisor, to add one more chapter at the very last moment to my PhD, focused on the media representation, media coverage of Africa as a continent. So images. Now, I promised Renata to talk about international journalism, and that's the topic that I was given. So, of course, it's related. When we talk, some basic concepts, when we talk about international journalism, we can come across other terms like global journalism, like global news flow, or international correspondence. I inserted, by the way, the photo that you may be familiar with, a controversial, in a way, photo that got a Pulitzer Prize, of a girl from Sudan, taken in '93. I think the commotion or the discussion that followed this photo resulted from the fact that it was not known what happened to this girl, whether she made it, whether she survived or not. And Carter, in fact, committed suicide a few years later. But this is one of the images, there will be more, that we often see when it comes to the coverage of different places, different countries in Africa. By the way, I have to warn you that I have an African sense of time. I mean, in Tanzania, they have a saying, and Kenya, in East Africa, they have a saying, you have watches, we have time. So when time comes, just stop me. Now, the main issues that we can address when it comes to international journalism, especially news, like who decides what news, what is news, why do these events get into news, what constitutes international news. I mean, why, to be honest, why should we be interested in what's happening far away and what doesn't have any relevance to us, is not going to affect us in any way? We often, talk about these bad journalists, on the other hand, and I'm going to show some images, covering Africa and other distant places in a negative way. But this is perhaps one of the strategies, or one of the ways to get us interested, to appeal to our emotions, because otherwise, why should we be interested in what's happening out there? So what constitutes news, how the international news is distributed, the issues connected with commercialization of news being a product that needs to sell. So it's not only about political or cultural ideology, it's also about money. News has to sell. That's why we have this clickbait phenomenon. and globalization. I'm going to give you some examples from Kenya again, where I had a chance to work with Kenyan journalists, which show this globalization phenomenon in the newsroom, and how this universal, if you like, journalistic culture affects journalistic cultures all over the world. Now, of course, it's very interesting, especially from the point of view that you are discussing here, ethics. News or international media and news in the context of conflict, in the context of us and them construction, whoever this them, if you like, are, then the notion, another important aspect mentioned in connection with international journalism is embedded journalism. So journalists being embedded, staying with the military, with the army in the places of conflict. Embedded journalism was actually given as some sort of solution to provide more witness-like reporting and more to create the impression that news is less dependent, if you like, on government institutions, which was the case, during the first war in Iraq in the 90s of the previous century. Then during the second intervention, journalists were sent just to show, look, you have images straight from the war zone, if you like. So it was meant to be some sort of solution to criticism, or an answer to criticism concerning government propaganda in war reporting. Another issue to think about is conflict journalism versus peace journalism. I will not have time to discuss it today, but the approach developed by Johann Galtung, so peace journalism, putting more emphasis on the human aspect of conflict rather than sensationalization, division into us, them, creation of the enemy, etc. Another important aspect in research on international journalism is media in the context of terrorism. Time permitting, I will also give you some examples today. And finally, media in the context of humanitarian disasters. 4 more points. Where does the international news come from? So the role of international news agencies or main global players, the notion of journalistic freedom and safety, CNN effect, more recently Al Jazeera effect, so how media coverage impacts on society's responses and, in consequence, actions taken by the government. And finally, something that might be of particular interest to you, ethnicity and religion in the context of international journalism. The major distributors of international news are elite nations. So we talked about, global players. United States, United Kingdom, France. If you think of 3 main news agencies, Associated Press, Reuters, Agence France Presse, they cover like 80% of international coverage. Other global players, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, becoming really powerful. So this is something important, something to know about or to think about when you think about where these images of distant places come from. So who has impact on creating these images. Now, a few comments concerning, I mentioned globalization, so the global mechanisms, or the global journalism culture. In general, yes, we can talk about the journalism culture. So, set of ideas, set of practices which journalists have to legitimize what they do. The terms that often appear in this context are terms like, again, terms you've been discussing or you are discussing here: journalistic ethics, professionalism, professional ideology. Alan introduced the concept of news culture, or national journalism cultures. Colleen Cotter talks about profession, internal and external cultural values. Internal, coming from the profession itself, like news values we're going to look at today, but external, coming from the culture around. So something that will explain the difference between, let's say, Kenyan journalists and Polish journalists or Czech journalists. And of course, journalists share some basic assumptions, values, definitions of what news is, what constitutes news, what news should be like, how the media work. And the fact that these values remain or have remained in the coverage somehow is the evidence of this shared global journalistic culture. But at the same time, if we compare journalistic work all over the world, we will find differences along, institutional roles, along epistemologies, as to approach to neutrality versus advocacy, ethical ideologies, etc. Peter Kasoma, so now back to Africa in a way, the founder of Afri-Ethics, insisted that journalists do share some universal values which are applicable in any context. However, at the same time, they should recognize some values that they find important and relevant in their, if you like, domestic or local or national context, so the needs of the people they are serving. There is an interesting book on Afro-ethics written by Kasoma. In this book, he gives an example of how African journalists should behave, let's say, if they go to hospital to interview someone who is, I don't know, a victim of some accident. So basically the person they are going to interview is in hospital. And he says, yeah, looking at the African standards, you should first inquire, even though you are going there as a journalist to have an interview, you should first inquire whether the person needs something, offer food to this person, offer money to this person. So be humane first, and then job comes later. When I mentioned this example to my colleague, who is an American journalist and also teaches media ethics at the University of Central Oklahoma, he said, no, I can't imagine that the journalist could go to hospital and offer money to someone. This is absolutely, I mean, from the American perspective, this is something unacceptable. It's just a job. I mean, the role of the journalist is to get information. So there will be these, interesting differences related to culture. So in the literature, you will often find, especially when looking at the African continent, some sort of conflict, as I've said, concerning what's ethical, what is not, what's objective, what's more neutral. There was an interesting research on journalism in Tanzania showing that, and this is connected with development journalists, that journalists see media as some sort of tool for national development. So this comes first, even before neutrality, the development of the country and promoting national ideas and also kind of national program in a way. I mentioned Afri-ethics, defined also as collective approach to ethics. African cultures, and I'm saying it on purpose. I have experience actually when it comes to working with East African journalists, so Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Uganda, and Zambia. But in general, as you know, probably most cultures in Africa are collectivist cultures. It's the group that matters. So it's the collective, or communitarian, that's another word that's often used, communitarian approach. And African models of Ujamaa journalism, so the journalism that is not neutral, it's that's promotes some sort of advocacy, and it's connected with this development model of the media. Okay, so this was just to show this sort of dialectics, or I don't know, conflicts, let's say, between what is universal and what is local, non-universal, and the discussion. Where should we go, in which direction? There are more problems or factors affecting, or factors which are often addressed or need to be addressed also when it comes to international journalism, explaining why there is not enough, let's say, coverage of distant places. So costs, of course, you know, it's costly to send journalists somewhere. Restrictions, so the safety of journalists, the fact that correspondents often change, so the turnover of foreign correspondents. Double standards, in a way. I mean, double standards, there's a very interesting article. I will send you the presentation and you will find the link there on Al Jazeera by an Egyptian journalist, correspondent, who talks about these double standards. That, you know, these foreign correspondents come to the place they don't know, which is, by the way, referred to, you might be familiar with this concept, parachute journalism. So it's a negative thing. Like, you know, they are dropped like with a parachute in the place they are not familiar with. They don't know the context. They have deadlines. They don't have enough time to cover the stories. Of course, they use local journalists who serve as sort of fixers. That's the term. So they provide translation. They set up interviews. They put them in contact with people. But then, in the end, so that's why she talks about double standards. In the end, the credit goes to these foreign correspondents because they actually made the whole story. Speaking of this, you know, providing contacts, etc. It's also very difficult, I would say, from a cultural point of view. I remember when I went for the first time to Kenya to collect data for my research. I went there for a month, and I assumed that a month is a whole lot of time, so I will manage to get everything I want. And I needed copies of articles concerning, at the time I was looking at, I collected data on post-election violence in Kenya that took place in 2008 after elections in 2007. So I thought, okay, I go to Media House, I tell them I need data, they give me data. And I went to, they have 3 main newspapers in Kenya, in the English language newspapers. English is actually the official language also, next to Kiswahili. And I went, and they told me, no, we don't have this data. This data hasn't been digitalized, so we don't have it. You can't have access to it. And basically I spent, months walking from media house to media house trying to get the data, and I didn't get anything. And then towards the end of the stay, I got to know one of the senior editors whom I told about my research, blah, blah, blah. And then with him, he was the one who made possible all my contacts, because he called people and said, this is Monica, she's the friend of our newspaper. Just give her whatever she wants. I trust her, I know her research. And from then on, because I kept going, I went after a few months to go to teach at the University of Nairobi for the whole semester, and then do research at the same time, it was much easier. So it is actually a culture of connections. People need to know you and people need to trust you. So it is very difficult for a foreign correspondent, if he is dropped like a parachuter, just to come and really get all the complexities of the story. Then another problem is lack of public concern. I mentioned it a while ago. Why should we be interested, I say we, meaning people, what's happening in, let's say, Kenya or Tanzania or Burkina Faso or Mozambique? It's far away. It doesn't really concern us. I know that my parents are interested because they know that I go to Africa quite often, so they are always worried, and they follow all the news. If there is some kind of famine or terrorist attack, even if it's in the other part of Africa, they always call me and say, there was this terrorist attack in this. But in general, people are not, or at least much less interested in something that's happening far, far away. That's why I mentioned at the beginning of this talk the concept of closeness or proximity, which I'm going to develop later on. Also, what we can observe is the trend towards more kind of lighter journalism, sensationalistic journalism, infotainment, information plus entertainment. It doesn't mean that it has to be funny, that news has to be funny, but there has to be some drama, some emotions, something that will make the audience interested in it. So again, how can you go over these barriers of lack of interest or focus on drama and entertainment or infotainment? Another issue is the fact that the international coverage often reinforces stereotypes that are already there. Like I gave you this example of people asking, did you see these children with swollen bellies in the streets? Do they have food? Do they wear shoes? Etc. Now, I will try to show that it's not always about bad intentions that journalists have when they use these stereotypes. So I will try to show you that there may be some other, or there is some other explanation also. And yet another problem that you can come across is the fact that more and more often foreign correspondents rely on the views of the Twitter elite, if you like, which of course, I'm sure you've had discussions about fake news, etc., which of course contributes to the spread of information that hasn't been verified, stereotypes, etc., and false information. I just included 2 quotes from this very interesting article. I do encourage you to comment, to look at it. So Dina says that when she talks about these double standards, she says it's unheard of for an Indian or Egyptian or Nigerian journalist to descend on London or Washington to cover a story and to employ a local fixer to facilitate reporting. So it doesn't work the other way around, the way it works in the global south, if you like. And then she also explains how this approach, or how the fact that local journalists are used in this way by foreign correspondents, how it also leads to deteriorating standards of local journalism. You know, after some time, these local journalists, they know what is expected from them. They know they know that drama is expected, negativity is expected, so stereotypical coverage is expected. So they basically offer what they think the West, if you like, or Western media want from them, and in this way doesn't very often, improve their standards of reporting. Even though, to be fair, I also, when working with Kenyan journalists, I heard stories that very often when they have ready-made stories about Kenya, especially stories which are quite controversial and concern politicians, and they know it would be kind of dangerous for them to publish because they could either lose their job, even though the situation in Kenya is not that bad. Journalists lose jobs or may end up in prison. They sometimes give ready-made stories to foreign correspondents to publish if the topic is really controversial and they are afraid of publishing it. So, to be fair, it's also sometimes their initiative. Now, why Africa, I explained at the beginning, and why I looked at, but the same could be said about Global South. Back in '92, Hawke said that Africa is special, of course talking about American audiences, because there is little common understanding between Africans and Americans to provide context for interpretation. As I've said, I mean, a lot has changed with social media, with access to information. Still, when we talk about distant places, distant cultures, it's actually the media that create this context for interpretation, that create these images in our minds that I mentioned, referring to Lippmann, and that's why they are so important. So, I'm not sure how many of these questions I will manage to answer, but I wanted to, my intention is to say why, or to provide an answer why is Africa, in this case, covered in such a way, the way it is covered. Why is it mentioned usually in the context of crisis, conflict, elite nation involvement, disasters, famine, terrorism more recently, because if you think of Al-Shabaab or if you think of Boko Haram, it's either Nigeria or Somalia, Kenya, that is mentioned in the news, at the mercy of humanitarian efforts of the West. On the one hand, these negative images, I mean, there are two kinds of effects, because on the one hand, okay, we have collective compassion, so people feel sorry. And by the way, there is also an interesting research showing some kind of incompatibility of interests of charity organizations and journalists, because charity organizations, of course, it's in their interest to show images of starving people living in very poor conditions, because in this way they can collect money. So it's in their interest to provide also these images to the media, so that the media can distribute these images, right? If you look at it from the perspective of the coverage, it does contribute to this very negative image of what's happening on the African continent. So on the one hand, yes, it's going to evoke collective compassion, it's going to motivate some fundraising, but on the other hand, and Susan Sontag, I'm sure you're familiar with some of your least term compassion fatigue, which of course doesn't only apply to Africa, but the fact that we are tired. And you know, when we get desensitized, when we get all these negative images all the time. And also the fact that the image, that the coverage gets superficial, over-emotionalized, simplified, etc., and contributes to enhancing this division between us and them, us staying in the comfort of our houses and them far away suffering. Another digression, I remember when I was as part of my research in Kenya interviewing people, the victims of post-election violence, and they told me, you know, Monica, for you it's just research. For us and our families, these are real tragedies. Many of us lost someone, our families, etc. And last year, I had a chance, I visited one of the places where Garissa University, it's the university at which there was a terrorist attack in which over 140 students got killed by Al-Shabaab terrorists. Interestingly, I think the media, or at least I'm not sure whether the Western, if you like, media didn't tell about it, but the first students who got killed were Muslim students who were praying, you know, very early in the morning. And then so it's kind of interesting if you think of this argument that terrorism is about, you know, religion, and it's, you know, killing in the name of religion. So these were Muslims who were killed first. And then, you know, the other students were actually killed because they could not recite Quran. So, so it's paradoxical in a way. But when I went there, so the attack took place in 2015, and I went there last year to Garissa. It's close to the border with Somalia. To this university, and they told me, my colleagues at the university told me, you can talk to the student who survived the attack and interview him for your research if it's useful. And I thought, well, okay. But I have to say that I felt it was really stressful for me, because I thought, like, this young man, in fact, lost many of his friends in the attack. He still suffers from PTSD, because I talked to him and he told me that he managed to escape, but many of his colleagues, friends, didn't manage to escape. He still has images of what happened. And it made me remember this phrase that someone told me, for you it's just research. It's like sometimes also for the media, it's just, you know, taking photos. But for these people, these are real tragedies that affected them and their families. Now, I don't know how much time I have left. I told you my African sense of time makes me talk for ages. But it's important for me, even if I don't manage to talk about everything, to show you the model that I have been developing, because I think also it may be interesting for you. The model, which has its origins in philosophy of language. John Searle is a philosopher of language, pragmatician. He developed the theory of social ontology, one of the people who developed such a theory, basically saying that it's language that constructs social reality. And of course he talked about, which I don't have time to discuss in detail, that to do so we need, for example, collective acceptance. So a group of people has to agree on status functions, so functions that are attributed to things, to people, to institutions, etc. So he said we need collective acceptance, we need institutional facts, and he developed sort of deontology of these social reality, as he called it. And basically, he said that it's the language makes it possible to create the situation in which something counts as something in a certain context. He usually gives this example when he has a lecture. He takes a banknote of $50 and says, look, this is $50. There is nothing in this piece of paper, nothing, that makes it worth $50. The reason why it's worth $50, it's because we agreed it's worth $50. So it's basically about making people agree that, you know, something is something. And I think the power of the media lies in the fact that using language and of course also technological affordances, so technology, they make people, they contribute to making people agree on something, generating this, contribute to generating this collective acceptance. Like I sometimes refer to the refugee crisis that we had in Poland back in 2015-16 with refugees from Syria. In Poland we had a refugee crisis without refugees, actually, because we didn't want refugees and they didn't want to come to Poland. But we had the crisis because the media created the crisis and people were really scared of Muslim refugees coming to Poland and starting to build churches, mosques, sorry. So media, journalists create this context in the minds of the audience, and they do it by, and here is the word, the name of the model, because the model is called media proximization approach, by bringing closer, so proximizing selected aspects of reality. Let me show you the graph. I'm going to talk about it tomorrow in the context of religion. But I mentioned these distant places that we don't have access to. So let's say, I don't know, Garissa in Kenya. But there are journalists who, let's say, have access to it, correspondents or local journalists. In the discourse, news discourse in this case, news discourse understood both as a product, so what we actually get, text with images and the verbal dimension, but also discourse as process, so all the journalistic routines. They, while creating this discourse, they select certain elements of this reality and bring them closer to us. So this the concept of proximization, by the way, was developed by Paul Chilton and then Zapp, who discussed it in the context of political discourse and kind of by politicians using the notion of threat as something proximizing, bringing it closer to make, to legitimize their actions. In my model, it's media selecting aspects of reality and bringing them closer. Spatial proximization, because it happens, you know, far away, but we can watch it on the screens of our phones or our TV screens. So it's brought closer. Temporal, because it might have happened in the past, but we see it as happening right now, unfolding in front of our eyes. Then epistemic, and here we go back to stereotypes that I mentioned. Epistemic proximization is about knowledge. So what elements are selected to present the unfamiliar things to the audience? This is something that explains using stereotypes, because you can, referring to something that the audience, you know that the audience already knows. It's much easier to present something new in terms of what the audience is already familiar with. I don't know, compare Sudan to Rwanda, let's say, or so basically past, for example, past events, or even use stereotypes. So this is part of this epistemic proximization. And then axiological, having to do with values. Presenting something as close or distant from our religious, cultural, including religious values, as being a threat to our values, creating some sort of axiological conflict, if you like. And finally, emotional proximization, which is about making the audience emotionally involved by using different strategies. Now, if you look at news values, so the factors that are behind selecting certain events and including them in the news, in fact, they can be linked to these dimensions of distance. So news is recent, yeah, it's about temporal distance or reducing temporal distance. Proximity, there is the news value of proximity, geographical and cultural proximity. We are much more interested in something that happens closer to us, simply because, and it's connected with another value, it's more relevant, it's more likely to affect us. So how can you present something that happens far away as possibly going to affect us or relevant for us? Negativity, which can be linked to emotional distance, and perhaps the reason why the news, the coverage of different places in Africa is so negative is, one, because people are so used to this, two, because this is likely to evoke some emotions, some compassion, some empathy. Consonance, which is another news value, it's about compatibility with preconceptions that people already have. So what people expect to see or want to see, again, could be linked to epistemic distance. Personalization, so presenting personal, stories concerning particular people. Research shows that it's also in charity, it's much more likely that people will feel empathy if there is a human face to the story, rather than talking about, I don't know, famine, somewhere you show the child that is dying, yeah, a particular child, and people are more likely to identify and feel empathy. So it's also connected with emotional distance. And superlativeness, the biggest, the greatest, the news value, again with this emotional distance or reducing the distance. There is an interesting, again, I will not have time to discuss it in detail, an interesting article, quite old, but I find it quite relevant, talking about emotionalization strategies in the news by Ungerer. And he actually mentions several principles that media or journalists use to evoke emotions, trigger emotions. And in fact, again, you could link them to this emotional distance, to these various dimensions of distance, to proximity, life and death principle, so personalization, for example, seeing particular people affected by events, rank and number, principle of emotional evaluations, or intensity of presentation, which can be again linked to the spatial distance. I mean, if you come closer, you see something in greater detail. This is the reason why close-up shots, as empirical research shows, are more likely to evoke emotions. Just because you are closer, you feel physically and thus emotionally closer. I should be finishing, right? Yes. Okay, so 3 more minutes. I wanted to just show you, and then I promise to sum up, the images that you can come across very often. The funny thing is that, to be honest, it doesn't really matter where the humanitarian disaster is, whether it's in Somalia or in Ethiopia or in some other country. The strategies, the images will be more or less the same. Yeah? Close-up shots of children's faces, because they are perfect victims, likely to evoke empathy. I remember a comment from my colleague, from Kenyan journalist, who said, would you show your children in this way in the news? Like the way you are showing our children or our people? That's the question, yeah? Whether we would really do it. It's much easier to do it just because they are far away and we can look at them, you know, from the comfort of our homes. There is, yeah, so that's about children. There are certain poses which are usually, in which children are usually shown as being attended to by doctors, being fed. Actually, there are some interpretations comparing images like the one at the top to Christ on the cross. So there are also interpretations like this, that these children are kind of, their suffering is compared to the suffering of Christ. Very often also the details are given of these children, like little Aminu, aged 12. Nobody's going to remember these details, but the very fact, and they can be as well fake, but the very fact that they are there somehow makes you feel that this is a particular child, real child, this age, so makes people more likely to get emotionally involved and feel empathy. Okay, I will not have time. As you can see, I have like 50 more slides, but I want to show one more thing. Speaking of foreign correspondence, in Kenya there is a hashtag they often use. They very often get very frustrated with CNN journalists because there have been cases where Kenyans were outraged at their stereotypical coverage, etc. So when Obama was, for example, visiting Kenya years ago, in CNN they said that he's going to the hotbed of terror. And it started an outrage among, Kenyan journalists. It was just one of the situations. So on Twitter you could find many Kenyans, shared tweets like this one, and that's their perception. I think they are quite skeptical about CNN, in contrast to BBC, but maybe BBC is better in a sense that they employ local Kenyans as correspondents, so local journalists. So it's a bit different coverage. And so Al Jazeera and BBC are much more liked, let's say, or popular in Kenya at least. Yes, so there was and also there was an attempt to reverse this phrase in CNN, so they started they started introducing phrases like Kenya as a hotbed of investments, culture, metals, etc., etc. And actually, even the representative of CNN came to Kenya, I think, one of the CEO people, to apologize for this coverage. Okay, I think I have to finish. In the last photo I wanted to show you, this is actually Kenyan newspaper, and it was the front page published after one of the terrorist attacks, Westgate Mall attack, which started an outrage in Kenya. And actually the editor-in-chief had to apologize on TV on behalf of the newspaper. I think the editor was suspended. And then I talked with Kenyan journalists after this, and in fact they regretted this choice. I mean, the choice that they found, after all, unethical, very unethical. But I think it shows, on the other hand, that I mentioned globalization at the end, that certain trends, like the trends towards sensationalism, drama, they are global in a way. So everybody, despite, let's say, the values that they claim they have different from ours, is susceptible to these temptations, actually, to publish something that's really, really dramatic and is likely to evoke reactions in the audience. I think I will have to, so this is the, yes, they had to apologize, the editor had to apologize, and it really was a very bad, let's say, moment for the newspaper. Just one final comment. On the other hand, when I compare the coverage of these terrorist attacks, what you could find there, that's going back to this communitarianism, emphasis on support from people, the joint actions, the community support. So that was something different that you could find in Kenyan media, of course, vis-a-vis international media, covering the stories and focusing on either on how many foreigners got killed in the attack. In one piece of news that I didn't have time to show, it was broadcasting, I think ABC News. The news started like this: 1 American and 20 other people got killed in the attack, yeah, which that was the last attack, Dusit attack in Kenya in 2019. I have to finish. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have questions or if you are interested in anything related to the topic, I will be around. I hope I have managed to show, because that's where I think the power of the media is. What gets selected and what they select, or the power of journalists, what they select and bring closer to people, because in this way they shape our perceptions of places which we cannot experience, if you like, in person. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Paromita. Thank you for your presentation. Just I don't know, comment or something. Don't you think there's an idea of a gaze that is working in terms of pictures that are being clicked, which sort of feeds into the idea of what Africa needs to look like, or Nigeria or Kenya needs to look like? And instead, I mean, this is my understanding, that instead of empathy as an emotion, perhaps what we are getting at is the idea of pity, is the idea of sympathy. We are not necessarily understanding their position, but we are trying to sympathize and have that sort of a power position, saying that, you know, this is what we are looking at, and hence they need our help. And that is where this entire idea of a gaze comes in, I think so. Because when it's the idea of looking at, of being looked at, right, for Kenyans in some sense.
I totally agree. So it's like, I would say, a patronizing in a way.
Absolutely
gaze.
patronizing.
So it's like looking at them from the comfort of your home, being in a safe, you know, and better position.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's Luke Boltanski writes about it, Kuliaraki, yes, so they talk about this gaze, or they also refer to it as spectatorship of suffering.
Absolutely. Which is where I think the idea is of pity rather than empathy is what I would feel. Yeah, just that.
Thank you for the comment.
Yeah.
Actually, thank you. When I started your lecture, I mentioned Said, and you made two same topic. You spoke about the same image, and you speak about the fixers as well. So maybe it's an interesting coincidence. So just anybody else? Everybody hungry?
So even more so, thank you very much for your attention. Once again, thank you very much for the invitation and giving me a chance to share my ideas. And I hope we will have more opportunities to interact.